Hi everyone, and welcome to this GCSE sociology lesson looking at the Marxist view of education. So far we've looked at the functionist view, looking at the work of Durkheim, Parsons and Davis and Moore. And what I'd like you to do first off is pause here and copy out those sentences and write down your answers. If you need to look back in your notes to find the answers, remember the trick, you always write it in a different colour so that when you're revising you know exactly what you did know and what you didn't know. So a couple of minutes, pause here and write out those 5 sentences and finish them off. When looking at the Marxist view of education, we have to take the same approach we've done when looking at the Marxist view of any other institution, for example, when we've looked at the family. And Marxists argue that society is ruled by the bourgeoisie in their interests at the expense of the proletariat. And they argue as such that the education system plays a really important part in keeping that going. 2 main phrases we're going to use a lot, and I want you to have a think about before I give you the answers what you think these phrases mean, and you can jot down or you could do a quick internet search and find out. Firstly, Marxists argue education reproduces class inequality. And secondly, they argue that education legitimizes inequality in our society. Can you have a think just for a second of what you think those 2 phrases mean? So let's talk about those in a bit more detail. Firstly, that education reproduces inequality. What does that mean? Well, it means that education keeps inequality going. Education is used by the bourgeoisie to keep the system going so that the bourgeoisie stay rich and the proletariat stay poor. The education system ensures that the wealthier you are, the better you do in school, and therefore you have more access to the top jobs. The education system works in the interests of the bourgeoisie. Secondly, education legitimizes inequality. The flip side of that is that the education system also makes it seem like this is okay, makes us believe that this is fair, makes people believe that this is acceptable, that it's the way that things should be, and therefore the proletariat don't challenge that system. They believe that they deserve to have lower jobs. They believe that they deserve to stay poor, and therefore they don't challenge the system and try to make things change. So the job we've got to do now is think about how the education system actually does that. The work we're going to look at today is the work of Bowles and Gintis, so 2 Marxists from the 1970s writing about their views on the education system, and their theory is known as correspondence theory. And they essentially argued what correspondence means is that school matches the workplace. So school matches up to the workplace and teaches people to get the jobs that they should get. Have a minute or two just to pause and have a look at this picture. What do you notice about the 2 different approaches to the education system? And which one do you think Marxists would be more likely to think about? So pause for a second and then we'll go through the ideas. The top picture shows a really creative, expressive classroom where children are learning through play, learning to be creative, learning to nurture, there's gardening going on, there's painting, there's the arts, as well as science. And then that kind of represents the functionist view. The idea that everybody has different skills and different abilities, and we need to nurture those and get ourselves ahead and get ourselves a job according to what we're able to do. Bottom picture is somewhat less happy, shall we say. There are children sitting passively. I find it quite ironic that they're there behind computer screens and the teacher's on a computer screen, as this is exactly what I'm doing right now. But the idea that children are passive, they're just being told information, and we have working class people aiming there and being built into working class jobs. They're doing manual labour, fixing toilets, they are making sandwiches, they are doing things that that aren't really inspiring them or allowing them to be creative. And this is the Bowles and Gintis view of education, that the education system prepares working class kids for working class jobs. So how does it do this? Well, Bowles and Gintis argue that schools are based around bourgeoisie norms and values, that schools are built on the elite ruling class and their view of how society should work. In order for capitalism to be successful, society needs obedient workers who don't realise that they're being exploited. So Bowles and Gintis argue that schools, the main job of schools is to teach working class students the skills that they need to be good workers. So yes, there is an element of they need English and they need maths and they might need some science and other subjects, but they're more focused on the other skills that we've learned about. So functionists call these informal skills, the informal curriculum or soft skills. Marxists have a slightly different take on this, but can you just spend 2 minutes, pause here, what were those skills? What were those things that were known as soft skills or the informal curriculum? What things do we learn in school that make us good workers when we're older? Well, Bowles and Gintis didn't like the phrase the informal curriculum. They went for the hidden curriculum. To have a think about why, as Marxists, they might want to call it the hidden curriculum rather than the informal one. They say that these are things that school teachers that are not on your timetable. So some examples of things that you might learn that are not on your timetable are respecting authority of your teachers and staff members. And that matches up with the workplace later on, where you're going to have to learn to respect your boss. You're also motivated in school by marks and scores and grades, and you're told to compete against other people for grades and scores. I can spend hours marking an essay that someone does, and all they want to know is what they've got out of 15, not my feedback, not my comments. People are taught to be motivated by comparing themselves to other people by numbers. Bowles and Gintis argue that that links to the workplace, where you're motivated by money, by pay, to compare yourself to other people and see your worth through a numbered system, a quantitative system. I've given you 2 ideas there. Can you come up with a couple more? What other factors are there in the hidden curriculum that Bowles and Gintis might have argued? What teaches working class kids to get working class jobs and be obedient workers? Some further examples then of how Bowles and Gintis argued that school mirrors the workplace can be seen in the table below. So they argue, as we've already mentioned, that school teaches you to respect authority, which prepares you for respecting your boss when you go to work. You're taught to be motivated by marks and scores and grades and compete with other people for those, so that when you get to the workplace, you're ready to be motivated by money, pay, promotions, and competition with other workers. We can also add in ideas like pupils have very little power about how they run their school. Some schools, if you watch the video on Summerhill that I asked you to watch a couple of lessons ago, do things very differently, but that's really rare. Children are very much at the bottom of the hierarchy when it comes to having power in the school, and that represents for Bowles and Gintis how workers have very little power when they get into the workplace. In school, this is my favourite, you're taught to manage your boredom. So you sit there and you might doodle in your book, or you might stare into space, look out the window, but you don't get up and run around. You don't get up and just walk away. And Bowles and Gintis argue that that prepares you for having a really boring job when you're older. When you're a worker, you have to accept doing a range of menial, low paid, low skilled parts of your job. And you're taught to accept that because you deal with that when you get some boring stuff at school. And finally, the fragmentation of the curriculum. Your curriculum is broken up into separate subjects. Your time is managed, your timekeeping is in the power of your school. You don't get any say about where you go and when. And Bowles and Gintis argue that mirrors how things are when you go to the workplace. Work is divided up. People don't see things through from start to finish. They do a small part of the process. And that means it stops you having too much power. If you only know about your small little section, you can't do much to support anybody else along the chain, which means you don't know what happens along the chain, which means you can't challenge things and you can't rise up and overthrow your bosses and take any power back. It keeps you in your place. The second half of Bowles and Gintis' study looked at the idea of myths, the idea that education legitimizes inequality and legitimizes the position of working class people in society. And they maintain that education is rigged in favour of the bourgeoisie. And they say it's hidden because they realise some people might become resentful, they might rebel, and that's not part of capitalism. We can't have this revolution that Marx talked about. We have to keep everybody exploited and unaware of the oppression that they face. So Bowles and Gintis argued that schools create myths to tell parents and children that prevent this thing from happening. So people are taught that if they fail, it's their own fault. So, for example, the curriculum is biased in favour of the upper and middle class culture. Think about things like Shakespeare, go to the theatre. Who has access to all of these things that are going to boost your education? How many people can afford? Obviously, no one's going on holiday at the moment, but to go on holiday to practice learning a second language and things like that. How many families can afford things to have at home that are going to support them in doing well at school? And Bowles and Gintis argue that education is biased in favour of the middle classes, and that teaches the working class that if they fail, it's all their own fault because they didn't have the right norms and the right values and the right ideas and interests. So the biggest myth of them all is that the education system is a meritocracy. Bowles and Gintis disagreed completely with the functionist view. They don't believe that everyone has an equal chance to succeed if they work hard. Have a think about this. Make a list. How many ways can you think of that show how having more money might make it easier for someone to get better grades? I've given you a few ideas, but make a little list for yourself. How might having more money make it easier for you to get better grades in school? And we'll come back to this in a couple of lessons' time when we look at social class and education in more detail. Finish up then, what I'd like you to do is reflect on today's lesson, summarise the work of Bowles and Gintis to no more than 5 bullet points. What do you think are the main things we need to know about Bowles and Gintis? And secondly, do you agree more, based on the last couple of lessons, with the functionist view or the Marxist view of education? And explain your view, please.